distinctive curriculum, organizing the college's first graduate programs, and what really interested me, amongst other things, instituting dual degree programs in places like Russia and Palestine, which I find fascinating. In essence, Dr. Bastine has turned Bard into a highly respected college with an international reach and reputation. He also has very progressive ideas about high school education and how science should be taught in America, but perhaps that's for another time that he can discuss with you. Perhaps most importantly, and certainly for tonight, are his writings and lectures about the exile experience. His perspectives on this are extremely insightful, and I'm very much looking forward to his presentation. So without further delay, it is a great pleasure to present a truly gifted individual, Dr. Leon Bastine.
So first I want to thank you all for coming. I'm not sure I would have done so if the situation were reversed. But it's extremely pleasing that as many people have turned out. I also have never been introduced by so many people. So I'm a little baffled because the actual result has to be a disappointment. This is the kind of thing that happens at a wedding or a coronation. I've thought of running for Pope. That's the one job I would exchange my current job for. But time is short. I'd have to convert, then be elected a cardinal, and then get elected. And even I don't have the persuasive powers to do that. But in any event, it's a pleasure to be here, and I haven't been that well treated in a very, very long time. Now, the irony is that I agreed to speak about a subject I know nothing about, which is going to be very amusing to those who do know something about it. But one of the advantages of inviting someone who is not an expert is that the approach to the subject might actually have some dose of common sense. Asher pointed out that the institution I represent has a long history with the question of the exile. So one has to understand that in the 1930s, when fascism triumphed in Germany, the college, Bard College, was an undergraduate unit of Columbia University. It was not an independent institution. And it was looked down on by Columbia University because Columbia is part of the Ivy League, and its position in the Ivy League is one of having a chip on its shoulder vis-a-vis Princeton, Harvard, and Yale, and the reasons for that are complicated. But the idea of having this college in the country 2 hours north of New York seemed a distraction to most of the Columbia faculty. But since, in fact, most American universities were relatively inhospitable to emigres, this was a great parking place for unwanted emigres. So the faculty at Bard became swelled by people that Columbia didn't want. And they ranged from the political editor of the Berliner Tageblatt to great precisionist painter Stefan Hirsch to what later became an exile from Italian fascism, who ended up Franco Modigliani winning the Nobel Prize in economics. And these unwanted people got their hold in Bard College. And one of the things I'll talk about in a moment is they were astonished, especially the German ones, with the American attitude toward education that was predominant in the 1930s, which was a progressive theory of education. These are people who had come to very traditional European secondary schools and universities, very unlike the American university. A very rigid secondary school curriculum in the gymnasium, and then a kind of very hierarchical university structure in which there was a single professor dominating a department, and very extreme rankings, and people had to wait till that person died before another person replaced him. And these were very authoritarian institutions, and where the PhD, the doctorate, was actually much less significant in its research content than an American doctorate, but the tenure line, which was the Habil, was a much higher one. It was sort of, our doctorate is between the Habilitation of a German university or the Kandidatia of a Russian university, which is a German imitation, and the European doctorate. So these were people brought up in but they had a very unusual reaction to the Bard context, which was self-developed curriculum, student-centered, all that language of post-John Deweyite student-centered curriculum, which sounded to many Europeans as American nonsense. But the smarter ones of them realized that there was something in the progressive ideology that was connected to democracy. That it was not an accident that their school systems and their university systems seemed completely compatible with the rise of fascism. If a German intellectual, Jewish or non-Jewish, fleeing Europe, had one surprise, it is the absence of resistance of the university community to tyranny. The same is true of the Russian post-Soviet university, and the development of an intellectual class that were frank apologists to tyranny, unfreedom, deceit, and even, in the area of science, contradictory claims about the nature of the universe. At least in a free society, we have senators who don't believe in evolution, but we have the right to knock them out of office, and we have the right, and also their hypocrisy is evident because when they are sick, they get admitted to a hospital, and the hospital does a diagnostic procedure, many of whose fundamental principles are based in claims about biology, which are located in an acceptance of modern science. So they actually aren't telling the truth about their own beliefs. But nonetheless, except that they're Christian scientists. But in these countries in the 30s, also with the rise of Stalin, the ability of intellectuals to resist and university communities to resist tyranny was extremely weak. So many of the emigres looked at the American progressive experience with great affection. Black Mountain College, Joseph Albers went to, the great medieval scholar of medieval music and Renaissance music, Edward Lewinsky, taught in this completely crazy kind of institution that had no rules, that was completely open, completely unlike anything they had ever seen in Europe. By the same token, at the University of Chicago and at St. John's College, institutions that were built in their curriculum in the 1930s as a way of persuading American students to understand the virtues of liberal democracy and not be taken in their view, by the extreme ideologies of fascism and corporate capitalism on the one hand, and of communism on the other. Many emigres became ardent supporters of these radical new curricula, core curricula, without grades, without required classes, something quite unheard of from the European context. So my own relationship to this issue is partly because I represent an institution that in the 1930s was transformed by this European emigration. And it continued when Bard became independent in the 1950s, and the emigres made a lasting impact on the curriculum. In fact, our great books curriculum was invented by a German emigre, not by an American. He happened to be a philosopher who was the husband of the philosopher Hannah Arendt. And he put into place the kind of curricular structure for general education that we still somehow work with. The other episode in the institution's history comes in the 1980s. In the 1980s, several of us felt that beginning with the exodus from Russia, from the Soviet Union, usually during the period of the first refuseniks, when Brodsky came out, and Solzhenitsyn came out, and Rostropovich came out. So several of us thought and that we're repeating the same problem of the 1930s, which is Einstein had no trouble being located. Despite his complaints, Arnold Schoenberg had no problem having a location. Famous people, Fermi. What happened to all the people in mid-career who weren't famous? Maybe famous only locally, but didn't have worldwide fame. If they were imprisoned, nobody would have collected signatures in the New York Review of Books. No wealthy, benighted people in Miami or New York would have felt proud passing the champagne for having put their signatures on an appeal to a tyrannical government to release that famous writer. What are the people we've never heard of? It's easy to rescue the most famous and most prominent. But what about one notch below? Writers, intellectuals, who are imprisoned or in danger, who actually need to be rescued. So we organized, with the help of several foundations, a way of getting people who were not known. Perhaps they were not known as Norman Mania was not known because of translation, or Miklos Harasi, the Hungarian writer, or Burmese or Chinese, where the American readership was unable to read even their work in the original language. We forget that Vladimir Nabokov came to the United States in 1940, completely obscure. Nobody ever knew who he was. He had written many novels. The only readership was the emigre Russian community. He couldn't find a job. When he finally found a job at Wellesley College, on a one-year contract as an adjunct, Morris Bishop had pity on him and gave him a 5-year contract at Cornell. But he didn't want to go to Cornell. After all, Cornell's in the middle of nowhere. It's in Ithaca. He wanted to stay in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he could work with his butterflies at the entomological museum at Harvard. So he went to the college president, Hildred McAfee. He said, I have an offer, to go to Cornell. I'd really like to stay in Wellesley. And she said, you're slightly eccentric, I'm not sure, you need to teach Russian. And she let him go. They then turned around and hired a complete mediocrity with tenure. Now, the problem is that the unknown was promise was something we thought we should look into. So in the 1980s, we developed a program to bring people by referral out of countries where they were in danger to the United States in ways that did not endanger their family. So the State Department cooperated, and they would be placed as visiting scholars in rural liberal arts colleges out of sight in order actually to do their work. And we brought a whole bunch of people out during the 1980s. So this is my own professional relationship to this issue of trying to deal with continuing the intellectual life of people whose existence is endangered. However, the discussion we have here today is really not about that. So let me start with a certain set of premises. The exile. Who is the exile? In the United States, in the history of the United States, it's extremely difficult to distinguish exile from emigration or immigration. What constitutes the state of exile? Now, the traditional exile is someone who is either been thrown out or has just left in danger, in the present danger of having been thrown out, that had to flee and was involuntarily fleeing. And that flight has to do with politics, exclusively politics. It's not they couldn't earn a living, that's not an exile. Divorce is not an exile. Running away from a wife you want or a husband you want to forget, that has happened too. That's not exile, that's just cowardice. So this is not, the only definition of exile is political, And it has to be involuntary. All things equal, one would have remained. And the reasons to remain cannot be purely personal. It has to be related to one's work, language being the most important factor. So I'm a writer, I live in Poland, Polish is my language, and I'm forced out of the use of my language. The classic case, of course, are the writers who had to flee Germany after 1933, who lost their language and most of their readership. The Russians who fled in 1917 to Berlin and to Paris and to New York were exiles. If miraculously somebody had assassinated Lenin as opposed to Trotsky and brought back some dowager princess and reestablished a liberal democracy or constitutional monarchy in Russia, they all would have returned within a reasonable time frame of 1917. If Hitler had been assassinated and the Nazi regime dismantled in 1937, there would have been a substantial re-emigration of people who considered themselves exiles. And the experience of exile has phases. So there were many observers who fled Germany in 1933, came to America, and had their bags packed. There's a famous anecdote of a professor at the University of Chicago, a classicist, who was not Jewish, but an ardent anti-Nazi, who had written on right after the seizure of power, the Enabling Act, a long diatribe in the Frankfurter Zeitung under the guise of the conspiracy of Catiline, taking Roman history as an example to try to expose the true intentions of the Nazi dictatorship. He was imprisoned. When he was released imprisoned and then confined to a village, working as a school teacher, he decided the time had come to emigrate. So he wrote various friends to see where they could get him. He had a temporary post at Oxford, but there was no future for him in England, so he appealed to America. He got an offer from Berkeley. And he tells the story. When he got the offer from Berkeley, he went to the Encyclopedia Britannica of Germans in 1930s was Meyer's Handbuch. And the Meyer's Handbuch had an atlas. He went to the atlas of his Meyer Handbuch because he didn't know where Berkeley was. And he looked and discovered it was near San Francisco in California, and he said, how will I get back to Germany? It was too far away. This is 1938. Now, so the exile, first stage of exile, because it's political and it is involuntary, there springs the hope that something will change. Now, it's not always the case, because in long-lived dictatorships, for example, Solzhenitsyn, or even Norman Mania in Ceausescu, these dictatorships have been around for a while, so the hope of change was very diminished. I think most people have asked intelligent university observers in 1980 would never have predicted the fall of the Soviet Union. So, someone like Solzhenitsyn going to Vermont, the idea of going back wasn't really present in his mind. Neither was it the case for Rostropovich. So, it's not always the case that there is the hope of return, but in the mind there is this notion of return. In the political context of the American landscape as a location of exile, we have to remember several things. First of all, this is a nation made largely of immigrants, and most of those immigrants are either voluntary or semi-voluntary immigrants who came for economic or global political reasons. Jews who didn't feel totally comfortable in the anti-Semitic Slavic world, who didn't have much to eat and no future, and weren't thrilled about conscription into the Tsarist army. Is that exile? No. the Irish who came in the 19th century, the Italians who came for economic reasons, the Europeans, they came for new opportunity. The Germans, the largest single emigration to America after the Revolution of 1848. This German immigration were not exiles. They came because their attitude to politics was not national, it was political in terms of notions of democracy and personal freedom. So they came to America and built communities in America. They retained their language. German was the primary second language of the United States before 1917. They attended Lutheran churches, the services were in German, and they had actually contact. And there was reverse emigration. The Austrian poet Nicholas Lenau came to America, worked on a farm, didn't like it, went back to Austria. Lionel Feininger, the painter, born in the United States, his parents were German immigrants, but they sent him back to Germany to become educated. And he made his career actually in Germany and then re-emigrated when the Nazis came to power. He had an American passport. That's not what we're talking about. That's about the immigrant experience in building the nation of America, where there is a continuing dialogue with one's national heritage, whether it be Cuban, whether it be Dominican, whether it be Mexican, whether it be Italian. That's a completely different matter. What we're talking about is the experience of exile among an intellectual and artistic class where the coming to America is for political reasons and not voluntary. The two most important moments are 1917, which is the Russian Revolution, a very important moment, and the other moment is 1933 to the beginning of the Second World War, the end of the war. There are two other moments worth looking at. One is the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, which led to a very elite and unusual emigration, and to some re-emigration. It's interesting, in Budapest today, Agnes Heller and others, Laszlo Bito, people made their career in the American university, moved back to modern Hungary to be part of the post-Soviet democracy. They were true exiles. They lived for decades in the United States in some status between two political universes, one imagined and one real in the United States. Then, of course, there are the so-called refuseniks who came to the United States in the 70s. Now, the central issue in discussing exile for me is the myth of the place from which you came. The notion that there is a home and that you are actually part of it. This is a very troubling myth. The notion of a center or of a community, political community, of which you believe yourself to be a representative, to which you have a comfortable sense of home. It might be real, but it's also constructed. And as the person experiences exile, the threat of exile leads to a distortion of that home. The experience of exile creates a fantasy of that from which you are no longer allowed to be a part. Again, the most eloquent witness of that is Vladimir Nabokov, who understood, born to enormous wealth, was 18 or 19 when the Russian Revolution happened. He had unimaginable wealth. His father and grandfather were major figures in Russian politics and in St. Petersburg society. His father was head of the Cadet Party and was assassinated by accident defending Milyukov in an emigre meeting in 1922 in Berlin. Vladimir Nabokov, as he left, understood, went to school, college in Cambridge, England, lived in Berlin, then Paris, and then finally in the United States. He understood that there was no Russia that corresponded to his memory. No, it was an imaginary place. His whole Russian language was an imaginary creation developed in exile, so to speak. He was suspended out of a political reality which had disappeared, a myth which he created as a fantasy. So there was a myth of home. The home was not only unattainable because it no longer wanted you. Take the Germany that, in fact, all the exiles left in 1933 to the American University. Werner Jaeger, the classicist. I'm choosing the non-Jews, because the Jews are a special case, which we can talk about, a very special case. But let us stick with the non-Jews. Thomas Mann, Bertolt Brecht, Werner Jaeger, there are endless numbers of them. The Germany, there was not one place Germany which they were a member of. They were a member of an imagined community within a place called Germany. What they did feel is that they had, and this is the very important insight that Hannah Arendt has to this question, that they were not pariahs, they were citizens. So Thomas Mann had a political voice, which he could exercise. He had a cultural voice, which he could exercise. That the exile was a function of having lost a battle in politics in the elections of 31 and 33. But the real question is, the Germany that developed between 31 and 39, was that the same place? Among the most interesting places for research on exile are two things: the efforts of people to return after the war and what they discovered, and the beginnings of correspondences between exiles and collaborators who remained. An example is the first letter exchanges between Bruno Walter, the conductor, and a composer whom he had helped, Hans Pfitzner, who was an ardent Nazi. And the attempt to bridge communication. The relationship between the violence Yuri Menuhin and the conductor Wilhelm Furtwängler, who was clearly a collaborator. In a complex case. Was there a home when the movie composer, the inventor of the modern movie score, to our detriment, Erich Wolfgang Korngold, an emigre, first voluntarily by the lure of Hollywood, and then involuntarily after the Anschluss in Austria, because he was Jewish, and he brought his father, the music critic, out. He was desperate to make a career in Austria after the war. He, of course, hadn't read a very famous satirical novel written in the 20s, Hugo Bettauer, called The City Without Jews. This was a futuristic novel about Vienna without its Jews. So a vibrant intellectual, cultural capital became a provincial backwater. That was exactly what he found in 1945. There were no Jews in Vienna anymore. And the people who remained, his beloved Austrians, didn't want him. And didn't want to hear about him. It was a crushing disappointment. There was no home. So all his pining in California about going back, which exiles went back who actually were classic exiles, waiting with their bags packed to return home. They were the German communists. Arnold Zweig, Bertolt Brecht. Now Hans Eisler was thrown out by us to East Germany. But they wanted to build a new society in East Germany and went back. The great sociologist Adorno went back and adjusted. But the case histories of people coming back show that the process of exile, that the two lines is that the place from which they exit or are thrown out, and they themselves, especially in the American context, evolve in opposite directions. And the way the exile, especially in the American university, developed was with a kind of independence of imagination, using the exiled place as a way by which, in a refracted way, to understand their home. Those of us who are born naturally into a home don't have that third angle, if you will, of analysis of where you are. But the experience of exile, by the invention of a place that no longer exists. Remember the Superman? Didn't Superman come to here because his planet was destroyed? Krypton, right? Isn't that right? Do I have this right?
Yeah.
My popular culture is not like good, but I think that's right. And that the kryptonite, when it came to him, it rendered him impotent. When the real Krypton came to him, that's a metaphor for understanding the exile experience. Absent any real evidence of where I left from, I feel somehow superior, different than the natives. I have powers they don't have. Classic role in the American University of the Exile is authenticity. I come from real German scholarship, and you are simply American bumpkins. You think you can read French? Wow, crazy. I really know French. Right? And so it goes. I know what research means. The exiles had a huge impact on the transformation of the research standards of American universities and of curricular standards. When they went to secondary school, every graduate spoke Latin, knew Greek, had substantial mathematics, could recite by heart the national poetry. And what does an American high school student know how to do? Absolutely nothing. They don't even have the discipline of work. Now, is it true that every Frenchman could recite Molière by heart? Obviously not. This is an invention of an elite culture that never existed. They're foolish people speaking French. It's not an accomplishment. There's an old Jewish joke of two Eastern European Jews who win a lottery in their town and the prize is to go to Paris. So everyone's jealous of them, and these two guys who split the lottery ticket go to Paris for a 10-day trip. They come back to their shtetl in Eastern Europe, and the whole town comes out to hear, because none of them have ever left this shtetl. What about Paris? So, and they're very blasé. And the people ask, well, what was the Eiffel Tower? It looks like the picture. Nothing in the left bank, right bank, nothing impressed them. So one person in the room gets ready and said, you mean you went 10 days to Paris on our money, the lottery money, nothing impressed you? He said, oh, on the contrary, imagine every child speaks French perfectly. So this kind of belief about culture and knowledge and standards, tremendous. The exiles also developed notions of intellectual civility and of an attitude toward America which was very much located in a kind of old world, new world taste, cultivation. In the music area, for example, the emigres had a terrible impact on American music. The field I'll focus in on a moment.